This 1863 photograph of two women appears graceful and refined, but historians later uncovered their real identities and roles. Dr. Rebecca Torres had spent 15 years studying Civil War photographs, yet nothing prepared her for what she was about to discover. On a quiet Tuesday morning in March 2019, the archives of the Charleston Historical Society sat in low light, filled with the smell of aged paper and preservation chemicals. Rebecca sat at a long wooden table, slowly turning the pages of a leather-bound catalogue titled Southern Portraits, 1860 to 1865. The image appeared on page 47. Two women were seated side by side in a formal photography studio. Both wore rich silk dresses with fine lace collars. Their hair was styled in the careful pinned fashion of the 1860s. The photograph was strikingly well preserved, the details still sharp despite the years. The catalogue description was brief. Two ladies of Charleston, 1863. Unknown subjects. Rebecca lifted her magnifying glass and leaned closer. Something about the picture felt wrong, though she could not immediately explain why. The woman on the left sat with her hands neatly folded in her lap, her posture straight, chin gently lifted. The woman on the right mirrored the pose, yet there was a difference in her eyes, a quiet alertness in her shoulders that was almost invisible at first glance. Rebecca photographed the page with her digital camera and continued through the catalogue, but her thoughts kept drifting back to that image. During lunch, she opened the photo on her laptop and began zooming in. That was when she noticed it. On the right woman's wrist, barely visible beneath the lace cuff, was a thin, dark line. Rebecca enlarged the image again. It was not a shadow or damage to the photograph. It looked like a mark, possibly a scar, or something more telling. Her heart began to race. She examined their hands next. The left woman's hands were smooth and untouched. The right woman's hands, though covered with elegant gloves, showed signs of calluses at the base of the fingers, visible through the fabric when studied closely. Rebecca leaned back in her chair, her thoughts spinning. In Charleston in 1863, deep within the Confederacy, who would allow two women to be photographed as equals? And why would one of them show signs of hard physical labor while dressed as a lady? Rebecca opened her notebook and wrote a single question. Who were they really? The investigation that would take over the next 8 months of her life began at that moment. The following morning, she returned to the archives with fresh determination. She asked for all records connected to photography studios operating in Charleston between 1860 and 1865. The archivist, an older man named Mr. Harrison, raised an eyebrow but brought out 3 boxes of documents. "Looking for anything in particular, Dr. Torres?" he asked as he set them down. "A photograph," she replied, showing him the image on her laptop. "Do you recognize the studio background?" Mr. Harrison squinted, then nodded slowly. "That's Whitmore's studio. See the painted column and the velvet drape? Jonathan Whitmore worked on King Street. He photographed wealthy families." Rebecca spent the entire day studying Whitmore's business ledgers. The leather books were fragile, their pages yellow and brittle. She found entries for many sessions, families, soldiers heading to war, wedding couples. Each listing included a date, names, and payment. Then she reached a page dated September 14, 1863. The entry stopped her breath. 2 subjects, private sitting, payment received in advance, no names recorded by client request. Rebecca photographed the page. A private sitting without names was rare for that era, since photographers relied on records for repeat business. She then researched Whitmore himself. Born in Boston in 1822, he had moved to Charleston in 1855. What stood out was a newspaper article from 1866, after the war. Whitmore had testified in court, and the reporter noted that he was known for quiet abolitionist views during the war years. An abolitionist photographer working in Confederate Charleston. The pieces began to connect. Rebecca compared the date, September 14, 1863, with historical events. That summer, the siege of Charleston had grown more intense. Union forces were closing in. The city lived in fear. Why would 2 women risk a formal portrait at such a time? And why insist on anonymity? As the archives closed for the evening, Rebecca shut her laptop. Outside, Charleston's historic streets glowed in the soft golden light. She passed elegant homes with ironwork and wide porches, imagining the secrets they had hidden. The next day, she would search property records and plantation registries. She believed the answers were waiting there. Her research led her to Charleston County property records. She focused on homes near Whitmore's studio, families wealthy enough to afford such a portrait. The list was shorter than expected. By 1863, many wealthy residents had already fled the city. One name appeared again and again: the Ashford household. They owned a rice plantation 15 miles outside Charleston and kept a townhouse on Meeting Street, just blocks from Whitmore's studio. Rebecca requested the Ashford estate documents. What arrived was a thick folder filled with wills, property transfers, and a detailed household inventory from 1864. It listed Richard Ashford, age 52, plantation owner. His wife had died in 1859. His daughter, Elizabeth Ashford, age 28, unmarried, managed the household. The inventory also listed 37 enslaved people by first name, age, and duty. One entry stood out: Sarah, age 26, house servant, lady's maid. Rebecca's pulse quickened. 2 women close in age, one the plantation owner's daughter, the other her personal maid. She returned to the photograph and studied their faces again. Then she found more records, letters written by Elizabeth to a cousin in Virginia, preserved in a family collection donated years earlier. Most letters were polite and ordinary, discussing weather and visits. But one from August 1863 contained a strange passage. The weight of what I know grows heavier each day. Father's sins are not mine, yet I carry their burden. I have made a choice that society would condemn, but my conscience allows no other path. Rebecca searched further. She found Richard Ashford's will from 1857. Among the listed property was an unusual clause: upon my death, the girl Sarah is to receive special consideration in her placement or sale, as her situation requires discretion. The wording was unusual and troubling. Rebecca dug deeper into Richard Ashford's past: marriage records from 1834, Elizabeth's birth in 1835, then something else. An 1831 estate document showed Richard had purchased a woman named Hannah, age 19, listed as mulatto, house-trained, and literate. Rebecca checked the 1,864 inventory. Again, Hannah was not listed. Burial records gave the answer. Hannah had died in 1847. Cause of death was fever. In that same year's plantation records, a birth was recorded. A girl named Sarah, born to Hannah in January 1837. Rebecca calculated the dates. Sarah would have been 26 in 1863, just like the maid listed in the inventory. Born only 2 years after Elizabeth. The meaning was shocking, but Rebecca needed proof. She knew she had to find Sarah's own words. Enslaved people rarely left written records, their lives erased by design. Rebecca searched every document connected to the Ashford household. After 3 days, she found a small leather journal in a collection donated in 1923. The handwriting was tight and careful, as if the writer feared discovery. The first entry was dated July 1862. Miss Elizabeth gave me this book. She says I should write my thoughts, though I fear what danger it may bring. Rebecca's hands shook as she turned the pages. Sarah's voice had survived. The entries were cautious at first, describing daily work, the weather, and distant artillery as Union forces approached Charleston. Slowly the writing became more personal. Miss Elizabeth insists I take lessons with her in the evenings. She teaches me to read and write better. Master Richard must never know. Another entry from March 1863 read, She told me today, with tears, that we share a father. You are my sister, she said, though the world will never admit it. I had always known in my heart. I see his face in mine as I do in hers. Hearing it spoken felt like lightning. Rebecca photographed every page. Elizabeth and Sarah were half-sisters, bound by their father's actions. The journal revealed more. Elizabeth planned to free Sarah after their father's death and send her north. But first, she wanted proof of their truth. The final entry was dated September 13, 1863. Tomorrow we do the impossible. Miss Elizabeth has arranged it with Mr. Whitmore. He understands our cause. We will sit together as equals and have our portrait made. She says there must be one true image of us, untouched by the world's lies. I am afraid and full of joy. Rebecca leaned back, overwhelmed by their courage. To understand the danger, she spoke with Dr. Marcus Williams, a specialist in Civil War social law. After studying the photograph, he spoke quietly. If they were discovered, Sarah could have been whipped or sold away. Elizabeth would have been ruined socially. This image breaks every rule of Confederate society. Her property could have been taken by relatives who claimed she was mentally unstable. And the photographer, Rebecca asked. Whitmore. He could have been arrested for helping rebellion. Abolitionist beliefs were dangerous, even rumors of them. People had been tarred and feathered for far less. Rebecca showed Marcus Sarah's journal entry describing the photo sitting. He read it slowly, then shook his head in disbelief. This was not just a picture, he said quietly. This was an act of resistance. Elizabeth was creating proof of Sarah's humanity, proof of their bond, in a society built to deny both. Rebecca went back to the archives with fresh urgency. She searched records from September 14 and 15, 1863, looking for any sign that the photo session had been noticed. She found a strange entry in Charleston police logs dated September 15th. It mentioned a disturbance near King Street. The report was unclear, noting suspicious activity at a photography studio, but said nothing improper was found during the inquiry. Had someone seen two women entering Whitmore's studio and reported it? Had the police actually come? Rebecca then found a letter from Jonathan Whitmore to his brother in Boston. N. Dated September 20th, 1863. I took a great risk this week, one that could cost me my livelihood or worse. But when a young woman comes to you, fully aware of the danger, asking only for one honest image of herself and her sister, a sister the law insists does not exist, how can a man refuse? I have hidden the negative carefully. Perhaps one day when this madness ends, the truth it holds will matter. Whitmore knew exactly what he was protecting. But where had the negative gone, and how did the photograph survive? Rebecca followed the timeline forward from September 1863. Sarah's journal ended after the photo session. Either she stopped writing or the remaining pages were lost. Rebecca searched records of what happened to the Ashford household afterward. Richard Ashford's death certificate showed he died on November 3, 1863, from heart failure and illness. His estate passed to Elizabeth as his only legal heir, but soon after, a probate challenge was filed in January 1864. Distant Ashford cousins argued that Elizabeth had been influenced by servants and Northern sympathizers and was unfit to manage the estate. Rebecca read the court testimonies. Neighbors claimed Elizabeth treated her servants with improper closeness. A former overseer said she failed to enforce discipline. The cousins won the case. The court appointed them administrators, stripping Elizabeth of her inheritance. A property inventory from March 1864 listed the forced sale of household goods and enslaved P.E. Opal. Sarah's name was there. Sarah, age 27, lady's maid, sold to broker for transport to auction in Montgomery, Alabama. Rebecca felt her throat tighten. Sarah had been sold away, torn from Elizabeth, sent deeper south where her future grew even darker. But what became of Elizabeth? Rebecca found a notice in the Charleston Mercury from April 1864. Miss Elizabeth Ashford has departed Charleston for destinations unknown. Her relatives declined comment. She had vanished. Rebecca widened her search beyond Charleston. She checked records in North Carolina, Virginia, and northern states where refugees often fled. For 2 weeks she found nothing. Then, by chance, she discovered a boarding house register in Philadelphia from July 1864. Miss E. Ashford, formerly of South Carolina, seeking respectable employment. Philadelphia, a Union city and center of abolitionist activity. Elizabeth had escaped north. More records followed. A newspaper notice from August 1864 read, "Lady of good upbringing seeks position as governess or companion. References available. Inquire at Mrs. Thompson's boarding house, Chestnut Street." Elizabeth had survived, but she had lost nearly everything except her conscience. But Sarah's fate still haunted Rebecca. She searched records in Montgomery, studying auction lists and sales, hoping to find Sarah's name. The war ended in 1865 and slavery was abolished, but the chaos afterward left many records missing. Rebecca began to fear Sarah was lost forever. The bar. Breakthrough came from an unexpected place. While studying abolition networks, Rebecca found references to a Quaker family in Philadelphia, the Thompsons, who ran a boarding house that sheltered refugees and former slaves, the same place where Elizabeth had stayed. Rebecca contacted the Historical Society of Pennsylvania and requested the Thompson family papers. They included letters, account books, and a diary kept by Martha Thompson from 1863 to 1867. Rebecca's hands shook as she read the entry from November 1864. Today, a young woman of color arrived exhausted and frightened. She escaped from Alabama and traveled for weeks through dangerous lands, guided by brave conductors on the railroad. She asked if we knew an Elizabeth Ashford. When I said yes, she wept with relief. She says they are sisters. Sarah had escaped. She had followed rumors and whispered names through terrible danger until she reached Philadelphia and found Elizabeth. Martha Thompson wrote that their reunion was the most moving thing she had ever witnessed. They clung to each other and cried for an hour. Elizabeth kept saying she had tried to free Sarah and failed. Sarah answered that she had been freed in every way that mattered long before she ever left. Rebecca learned that Martha Thompson helped both women find work. Elizabeth became a teacher for freed children. Sarah learned dressmaking and later opened her own shop. A marriage record from 1867 showed Sarah married a free man named Thomas, a carpenter. Elizabeth never married but stayed close, living nearby, often mentioned in letters as Aunt Elizabeth. Rebecca found later photographs. One from 1870 showed Sarah, Thomas, and their two daughters outside their home. Elizabeth stood beside them, older, her hair gray but smiling. They had built a family based on truth, not lies. One mystery remained. How did the 1863 photograph survive? Rebecca found the answer in Whitmore's estate records. When he died in 1889, his studio contents were sold. A collector named James Morrison bought the negatives and prints. His collection was donated to the Charleston Historical Society in 1931. There, mislabeled as Two Ladies of Charleston, the photograph waited nearly 90 years to be understood. With the mystery solved, Rebecca faced a final question. Should the story be shared publicly? She worried about descendants and their reactions. She began searching for living relatives. Sarah and Thomas had 4 children whose families spread across the country. Through careful research, Rebecca found Margaret, a retired schoolteacher living in Brooklyn, Sarah's great-great-granddaughter. They met in a cafe in November 2019. Rebecca showed her the documents and images. Margaret said her grandmother spoke of Charleston and a woman named Sarah who escaped slavery, but details were faint, like echoes. Rebecca showed her the photograph. Margaret stared, tears filling her eyes. "That's her? That's Sarah?" "Yes," Rebecca said gently, "and the woman beside her is Elizabeth, her half-sister." Rebecca explained everything. Margaret listened in silence, then said she always heard of a white woman who helped the family in Philadelphia, never knowing she was Sarah's sister. "Elizabeth gave up everything," Rebecca said, "and Sarah crossed hell to find her," Margaret replied softly. They sat quietly, the weight of history between them. Margaret asked what would happen next. Rebecca said it was her choice. Margaret looked again at the photograph. "Tell their story," she said. "Tell all of it." Rebecca published her research in February 2020. The response was immediate. News spread fast. The photograph was shared worldwide. But the deepest impact came from families who wondered if their own stories waited in archives. The Charleston Historical Society organized an exhibition called Hidden Kinship, the Ashford Sisters. Rebecca and Margaret curated it together. At the opening in August 2020, Margaret spoke. She said Sarah and Elizabeth lived in a world that denied their bond. The law denied Sarah's humanity. Society demanded Elizabeth's superiority. They rejected those lies. She pointed to the photograph. This was not just a picture. It was an act of revolution. They risked everything for one honest moment, and they won. Because more than 150 years later, their truth survived. People wept. Others came forward with their own photos and questions. This was only the beginning. The Historical Society launched a project to identify enslaved individuals in photographs. Rebecca received funding to continue her work. Margaret became an advocate, speaking across the country. The photograph was restored and shared online. It appeared in books, films, and museums, not only as proof of cruelty, but of resistance and love. In 2021, Margaret received an email from a descendant of Elizabeth's cousins, expressing shame and respect. They met in Charleston, visited old streets, Whitmore's studio site, and the burial grounds. They found Hannah's unmarked grave and placed a proper stone. One last time, Margaret and Rebecca stood before the photograph. Margaret asked what the sisters would think. Rebecca said she believed they would say it was worth it, every risk, every loss, because love survived, and truth survived. As they left, the sun stretched shadows across the streets. Somewhere within them, Rebecca imagined, two sisters walked together at last, remembered not as mistress and slave, but as family.